With the experiment in Catholic republicanism in France during the wars of religion there, and the establishment of a Catholic republican system in Poland, which interestingly combined religious liberty with the establishment of the Catholic faith and an elected monarchy, the Catholic faith seemed like quite a radical form of religion at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. After all, the last Valois king of France was assassinated by a Dominican lay brother, and the Pope, when he heard about this, celebrated this Dominican lay brother as a hero of the faith in an allocution delivered in Rome. It was also seen as rather radical because of the Gunpowder Plot at the beginning of the 17th century. Elizabeth I, who'd established Protestantism definitively in England, died without any heirs because she never married, and her cousin, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England. It was hoped by many Catholics in England that he would ease the brutal persecution to which the Church had been subjected under Elizabeth, but in fact he didn't appear to do that, and it seems that this frustration boiled over in a plot to try and assassinate the king and the royal family and the entire aristocracy and political nation of England by exploding the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament met during the state opening of Parliament, when the House of Commons, House of Lords and the king and his family would all be present. It's not impossible that this plot is completely illusory. There is a theory that, in fact, it was James I's chief minister, who he had inherited from Elizabeth I, who was concerned that because James had made peace with Spain, it would become possible for English Catholics to legitimately fight as mercenaries for the Habsburgs, who were fighting a very long war, the 80 Years' War, against Protestant insurgents in the Low Countries, that the English Catholics would be able to go over there, form themselves into military units, which could then potentially form a threat to the Protestant ascendancy in England, and that he created a kind of false flag by persuading a group of these English Catholics that they were going to assist the Habsburgs in the Netherlands, when in fact he was going to frame them for trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament. This is a very involved issue, so I'm afraid you'll have to go and look up the theories for yourself and try and work out who you believe on the question. But nevertheless, it shows the association of Catholicism with political radicalism and republicanism at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. It was at this time that James I himself, who was something of a scholar, invented the theory known as the divine right of kings. People often falsely suppose that this theory arose from the Middle Ages, but that's not true. The theory of political obedience in the Middle Ages was that human beings are naturally social and political animals, and therefore they naturally live in law-based societies, which have to have legislative authorities in them, and executive and judicial authorities obviously as well, and therefore the powers that be are derived from God through human nature. But the form of government can be very various, as it was in the Middle Ages. There were many different forms of government in Christendom. This theory, the Catholic theory of the origin of civil legitimacy, is not compatible with the nominalism that lay behind the Reformation. And in fact, as soon as the Reformation broke out, very serious rebellion broke out in Germany, which Luther turned on violently, and he promoted a completely amoral theory whereby the civil power can do anything it wants, and that a temporal ruler is absolved essentially from the moral law, that he has one personality as a Christian and another personality as a prince, and that he can do anything he likes in order to effectively govern over his people. And the peasants who revolted following the Reformation in Germany were brutally massacred with the warm encouragement of Martin Luther. Now, following on from these sorts of perspectives, James VI and I developed this theory that the only really legitimate form of government is a hereditary monarchy in which the king has completely unfettered power. No one can judge his actions. He will have to explain himself to God when he dies, but no one can judge his actions while he's alive, and that he's essentially a god on earth. In fact, he uses these terms in some of his addresses to Parliament. This is a very extreme theory which is not supported by the Catholic Church. In fact, when the chaplain to the King of Spain tried to propound this theory in a sermon, he was arrested by the Inquisition because they viewed the divine right of kings as a heresy. And works against James's theories were penned by the great Jesuit doctor of the Church at the time, Robert Bellarmine, and James VI and First wrote back against Bellarmine. So the Church was very much associated with limited and even republican forms of government, not with the divine right of kings at all. James VI and First remained quite a mainstream Protestant of an Elizabethan kind. He wanted officials called bishops. They weren't really bishops because Anglican orders had perished in the reign of Edward VI due to defect of form and then defect of matter in the reign of Elizabeth I. But he wanted officials who took the name bishop to exist in his Church of England in order to maintain a hierarchical structure, lest a too democratic structure of the type favoured by Calvin undermine the position of the monarchy. Charles I, who was James's son and successor, he was even more concerned about such questions, and he believed very much in his father's ideology of the divine right of kings, and he began to try and Catholicize the externals and in some degree, the doctrine of the Church of England. And really the idea of Anglicanism as a halfway house between Catholicism and Protestantism is not original to the kind of Anglicanism that existed under Elizabeth I, but is really a creation of Charles I's reign. This greatly angered the Protestant establishment of England, men whose ancestors had enriched themselves on the properties of the church and of the monasteries, and who were strongly committed to Protestantism in a more pure form. They were called Puritans because they rejected the remaining residual Catholic-ish elements in the Church of England, particularly this pseudo-episcopacy which it possessed. They were dissatisfied with Charles's attempts to move slightly more towards Catholicism. They were already unhappy with the settlement under James I, and so they increasingly emigrated across to the Americas and were the establishers of the first English-speaking colonies in the Americas, with one exception, which was Maryland, which was established by Lord Baltimore, who was in fact a Catholic. And because of the slightly greater tolerance of Catholics under Charles I, he thought that he might be able to establish a colony where Catholics could live freely. He wouldn't be able to establish an actual Catholic colony, that would be too much for the king, but he was able to arrange for Maryland to be a palatinate, one where the owner of the colony had almost unlimited power to legislate, mint coins, etc. And that allowed him to institute a system where anyone who believed in the Trinity would have religious liberty, and therefore he hoped that that would allow it to become de facto a Catholic colony. In fact, the Catholic character of the colony was relatively short-lived because Protestants came also in large numbers, and the surrounding Protestant colonies were very disapproving of the idea of a Catholic colony, and so they tended to try and overthrow the government of Maryland and seize it for Protestants. But it nevertheless was an interesting experiment, a kind of parallel to what was attempted in Poland, where they managed to maintain a Catholic establishment while also having religious liberty. The tensions which were growing in England over the slightly Catholicizing path and the definitely absolutist path of Charles I eventually boiled over into a civil war when Charles tried to Catholicize the Church of Scotland, which had embraced a more advanced form of Protestantism. The Scottish Protestants rebelled. Charles was forced to summon the English Parliament in order to try and raise revenue because of the limitation on the English crown established by Magna Carta, that it needed the council of the whole realm in order to levy a tax. And the Parliament refused to cooperate because of its disapproval of Charles's religious position. This led to a civil war between the Crown and Parliament. Eventually the king was defeated and ultimately executed, and a sort of Protestant dictatorship was established under the General Oliver Cromwell. He found it most difficult to exercise rule over Ireland because, of course, Ireland had a large Catholic majority and they had taken the opportunity of the Civil War to overthrow the Protestant ascendancy there and establish a Catholic Commonwealth, which acknowledged Charles I as king, but restored the local government of Ireland by Catholics. They were brutally put down and massacred by Cromwell, who was a very effective ruler despite his unfortunate convictions. Eventually, Cromwell died and was succeeded by his rather inept son, who was soon removed, and Charles I's son, who'd escaped to the continent, Charles II, was restored. He did not hold to genuine Protestant convictions. He had been led by his father's experience to realise that, in fact, Catholicism was true, as had his younger brother. This was particularly significant because his younger brother was his heir, because Charles had no legitimate children. He didn't become a Catholic during his reign because that would have been very dangerous to his political position, and also perhaps because he was an extremely lecherous and immoral man who had many, many, many mistresses and many illegitimate children. But he upheld his brother's right of succession, and his brother was a public Catholic. Charles II was only conformed to the Catholic faith on his deathbed. It was known that the Duke of York, after whom in fact New York is named, Charles's brother, was a Catholic, and that therefore there would be a Catholic king when Charles died. The Protestant establishment in the House of Commons, many of them wished to exclude the Duke of York from the throne for being a Catholic, but others who believed in the divine right of kings, they weren't Catholics, but they were strong believers in the divine right of kings, rejected the idea of an exclusion. This led to a division of the House of Commons into two parties: the Whigs, who were in favour of exclusion, and the Tories, who were opposed to exclusion. These are the first two political parties in the modern world. In fact, the first two political parties, just absolutely speaking, and and it's from those parties that the modern political parties in Britain and the Commonwealth and in the United States have all developed. The Duke of York did come to the throne as James II, and the Protestant establishment was willing to endure him, though they were not happy about him, because he had only two daughters and they both had been raised while he was still a Protestant, and therefore it was thought that the throne would eventually go back to a Protestant after an unpleasant period in which the king was a Catholic. However, James had remarried after the death of his wife Anne Hyde, and his new wife, Mary of Modena, although she didn't have any children for a number of years, she did eventually give birth to a son, and this son, his rights would trump those of any daughters, and he would be raised as a Catholic. This led to a conspiracy against James II and his deposition by his son-in-law, the Prince of Orange, who became William III of England, and who eventually managed to conquer Scotland and Ireland as well. And James II was driven into exile, and an attempt by him to return with the support of the Irish was defeated, and the Protestant ascendancy re-established in the British Isles. Meanwhile, on mainland Europe, the Habsburg dynasty had divided its dominions in two after the abdication, because of despair over defeating the Reformation, of Charles V in 1555. He gave Spain and the Americas and the Netherlands to his son Philip II, and he left the title of Holy Roman Emperor, Germany, Austria, and Bohemia and Hungary to his brother Ferdinand. So there became two branches, the Austrian and the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs remained extremely zealous in their defense of the faith, but the Austrian branch became very lax and skeptical and dabbled in occultism, and one of them died refusing the sacraments, very tragically. But then, in the second decade of the 17th century, Ferdinand II became the heir of the Austrian Habsburg branch, and he was a zealous adherent to the Counter-Reformation. He decided to try and prevent the further spread of Protestantism within his dominions, particularly in Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, where Protestantism was very established because Bohemia had been the home of Jan Hus, an early reformer who anticipated some of the elements of Protestantism at the time of the Council of Constance in the 15th century, and so it was particularly ripe for the development of Protestantism. The people of Bohemia reacted, the aristocracy anyway, reacted against the attempt to limit the growth of Protestantism in Bohemia by Ferdinand II. They declared him deposed and elected the Elector of the Palatinate, a man who was already a Protestant, as their king. That would have given the Protestants a majority in the electoral college which elects the Holy Roman Emperor. So this would have been a turning point in European history and possibly led to a definitive victory of Protestantism over Catholicism. The Habsburgs rallied, however, and deposed Frederick of the Palatinate, and essentially reached the point where they could have achieved a complete military victory over Protestantism in general, at least outside of the British Isles, because they successfully conquered Denmark and were even hoping to build a new imperial port on the Baltic so that they could have ultimately eliminated Protestantism in the rest of Scandinavia. However, the Bourbon dynasty in France were not willing to see the Habsburgs triumphant on that scale and rapidly began to subsidize all possible enemies of the Habsburgs. In fact, they'd already in the previous century entered into an alliance not only with the Protestants but with the Turks in order to promote Islam to the disadvantage of the Austrians. And eventually this war between the Catholics and the Protestants in Germany ground on for 30 years, hence its name, the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, and it was concluded with a stalemate after many, many, many deaths. A larger proportion of the population of Germany died in the 30 Years' War than died in the Second World War, shockingly. And this Peace of Westphalia, which ended the war, reasserted the unhappy compromise of the Peace of Augsburg, which had ended the original war between the Habsburgs and the Protestants under Charles V. And both of these treaties asserted a principle inimical to the principles of Christendom, cuius regio, eius religio, who reigns, his is the religion. This means that the temporal power determines what the spiritual power is within its territories. That is the opposite of the principle which was established by the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, which established that the spiritual power establishes the temporal power and judges it if it is not good. So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 and its predecessor, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, were key stages in the unwinding of Christendom. Several other unfortunate events occurred in the course of this period. One was a dispute within the Catholic Church over the Catholic doctrine of predestination. Predestination is, contrary to popular belief, Catholic doctrine. Catholics simply don't believe that God deliberately makes people in order to send them to hell, or that Christ only died for the elect. But we do believe that salvation is through the grace of God, and therefore ultimately God's decision to save, or his non-decision to save, in the case of those who are damned, is the determinant of one's salvation. And this doctrine was very much upheld by all the traditional Catholic medieval schools associated with the various different religious orders. But the new religious order of the Society of Jesus, which was winning great victories against Protestantism in converting various regions of Europe back to the Catholic faith, adhered to a rival theory called Molinism, according to which one's actions after one is justified retrospectively merit the gift of justification through a kind of hypothetical foreknowledge by God. This was seen as metaphysically and theologically extremely dangerous by the other religious orders, and there was a very bitter dispute on the subject, particularly between the Dominicans and the Jesuits. The popes tried to arbitrate this dispute through a commission called the De Auxiliis Commission, the commission concerning helps, that is, the helps of God's grace and their role in salvation. The commission repeatedly concluded that the Jesuit theory was unacceptable and incompatible with Catholic doctrine, and it concluded that the Dominican theory, the Thomist theory of physical promotion, was free of all doctrinal error. But its final condemnation of the Jesuit position was never permitted to be issued by the commission, because the Pope was frightened of the harm that would be done to the prestige of the Jesuits if they were condemned for an error which came close to the straw man of Catholicism, which Protestants would use against the Catholic faith, the claim that the Catholics believe in salvation by works. And so he suspended the commission without it coming to a definitive judgment. This is Pope Paul V. He said that it would He did. It was important, and it should come to a judgment eventually, as soon as possible, but not quite yet. That, unfortunately, is 400 years ago, and no definitive judgment on this question has been issued. And this has actually caused a number of problems in the church, the first of which was a heresy called Jansenism. Jansenism was a really form of Catholic Calvinism, which denied that Christ died for all men, and saw the Eucharist as a reward for virtue rather than as a medicine for venial sin. And it became very prevalent, partly because the Dominicans and the Jesuits had been told they weren't allowed to argue with each other in public over the issues discussed in the De Auxiliis Commission, which meant that the Dominicans were prevented from defending in a vigorous way the traditional Augustinian position, the position of St. Thomas, concerning predestination and salvation. This created a vacuum for this kind of Catholic Calvinism, which would lead many people in the Low Countries and in France and elsewhere into error, and created a serious antagonism between various theologians in those countries and the Holy See and the Jesuits. This problem led further on into another error called Gallicanism. Gallicanism is the idea that the French church, and by extension other local churches, have a kind of immunity from the authority of the Holy See, that the Holy See can't legislate for them without their consent, that the Pope, although he's the only one who can make an infallible definition, it's not infallible until it's consented to by the whole church. So this really eviscerates the Holy See of its central powers, universal ordinary jurisdiction, and its infallible magisterium. After the stalemate conclusion of the 30 Years' War in 1648, France emerged instead of the Habsburgs as now the most powerful state in Europe, and France was deeply immersed in absolutist royal ideology. And so from this point, where the church, the Catholic Church, becomes identified by Protestants with absolute royal government rather than with the kind of republican ideas it was associated with at the beginning of the century. And along with this absolutism came a desire by the government in France, which didn't approve of Jansenism, but a desire to promote Gallicanism and to limit the authority of the Pope in France. The popes were very annoyed about this, and there were various conflicts between King Louis XIV of France, who's the sort of exemplar of this absolutist royalism, and the Holy See. There was a period when many dioceses in France were left without bishops because the king would only nominate bishops who were in favour of Gallicanism, and the Holy See refused to confirm any bishops who were in favour of Gallicanism. This was eventually resolved later on, in a period when Louis XIV became rather more pious. He was something of a hedonist philanderer at the beginning of his reign. The cynicism and self-interest of the French crown became a really serious problem for Christendom and prevented a final victory for Catholicism in the conflicts that followed on the Reformation. This cynicism was also displayed in the siege of Vienna in 1683. Vienna was the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs. The Turks decided to make a second attempt to capture it. It was strategically crucial because it forms a major fortress between the Carpathian and the Mountains and the Alps, which it's impossible to extend. A ruler who ruled the Balkans, as the Turks then did, couldn't extend into the rest of Europe without capturing Vienna, because if such a fortress were behind it, then its lines of communication could be cut off. Therefore, to prevent Vienna falling was absolutely essential to the very survival of Christendom. But the French crown refused to assist the Holy Roman Emperor in this defence. Fortunately, he was rescued by the elected King of Poland, King Jan Sobieski, who arrived with his Polish hussars and made a dramatic charge, greatly outnumbered, possibly more than 3-1, but he made a dramatic cavalry charge, which he personally led down the Kallenberg outside Vienna against the Islamic forces, which according to some contemporary estimates, there's argument about this, but may have been as much as 350,000 against a force of less than 100,000. This cavalry charge was dramatically successful. The war banner of Muhammad himself was captured by the king in person. The Grand Vizier only just managed to escape and was later lynched by order of the Sultan for having failed so spectacularly. And this great moment, the Battle of Vienna, became the turning point in the struggle between Christianity and Islam up until the second half of the 20th century. From the death of Muhammad until the Battle of Vienna, Islam had consistently expanded its net territorial extent across the surface of the earth until the victory of the Habsburgs and of the King of Poland at the Battle of Vienna. From that point until the second half of the 20th century, Islamic territory shrank and shrank and shrank relative to the area ruled by Christianity. But as I say, the French refused to assist in any way. In fact, this was even memorialized in an inscription in Vienna, pointing out the greatness of the victory and the fact that there was no assistance from the French. Louis XIV, in order to try and revive his Catholic credentials, he decided to abolish the limited toleration for Protestantism, which had been established in France by the founder of his dynasty, Henry of Navarre, as a compromise conclusion to the French wars of religion. Contrary to what one might expect, the popes were very disapproving of this move because they wanted the voluntary conversion of Protestants to Catholicism in France. They didn't want Protestants to be bullied into becoming Catholics or be driven out of the country by the abolition of toleration. But so from this time in the 1680s until just before the French Revolution, Catholicism was the only legal religion in France, a situation which reflected, in fact, more the absolutist ideology of Louis XIV than it did any convictions of the Catholic Church. The Byzantine Christians in the Kingdom of Hungary were also reconciled to the Catholic Church during this period by the Union of Uzhgorod, from which the modern Byzantine Ruthenian Church in the United States and in Eastern Europe is derived. A very unfortunate incident occurred in the course of the 30 Years' War and just before, when Galileo Galilei, a philosopher and natural scientist in Italy, advanced the theory which had already been proposed by the 16th century Polish scientist Copernicus, that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than the Sun revolving around the Earth. The increasing effectiveness of telescopes in the West meant that the classical theory, going back to Aristotle, that the Earth is the bottom of a vast spherical universe and that the heavenly bodies are embedded in a series of spheres, had become increasingly difficult to maintain. However, it still remained the best mathematical theory despite its problems. Galileo, ironically, didn't successfully prove his theory, even though in fact it turned out to be correct, that the Earth and the other planetary bodies revolve around the Sun. The popes actually sponsored his writings, even though the Pope did not agree with Galileo's theory. He agreed to pay for and allow the publication of a dialogue discussing the different theories called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, so long as his view was also represented. Unfortunately, Galileo chose to represent the Pope's view with a character called Simplicio, which essentially means idiot, and the Pope was duly offended, and Galileo was eventually condemned by the Congregation of the Index and by the Holy Office. He was condemned for claiming that you could prove from Scripture that the Earth revolves around the Sun, which isn't true, even if the Earth does revolve around the Sun. The result of this was that Protestants were able to depict the Catholic Church as hostile to science, which of course was quite the opposite of the case. The Catholic Church had a very advanced and enthusiastic attitude towards the sciences. In fact, the hypothetico-deductive method is essentially a creation of the medieval universities. But this calumny has stuck despite some of the greatest scientific theorists of the modern era being Catholic clerics and religious. And so the Galileo affair is probably the worst PR disaster in the entire history of the Church. This disaster was made worse by a new movement which emerged from the 30 Years' War and the stalemate which concluded the 30 Years' War, and that's a movement called the Enlightenment. It having become impossible to determine for the whole of Western culture what the objective meaning of divine revelation is, because there was no longer an international tribunal which was accepted as infallible and final, which was the official interpreter of divine revelation. Therefore, the content of divine revelation became impossible to establish, and therefore the Reformation morphed into the Enlightenment, the movement to eliminate divine revelation as a principle of public policy and public law. And this movement would define the 18th century and bring Christendom to its ruin.